Good morning, everyone. Our first session is going to be on the Middle East. So we are going to have 3 speakers. Each of them will speak about 25 minutes. And then at the very end, we will have a half an hour general Q&A. So please, if you have any specific questions for individual speakers, note down your questions, and then we'll get a chance to have a conversation about it. So our first speaker this morning is David Roxburgh. He's the Prince Al-Walid bin Talal Professor of Islamic Art History and the Chair of the Department of History of Art and Architecture at Harvard University. And his research focuses chiefly on the arts of the book, albums, and calligraphy in post-Mongol through early modern Iran, Afghanistan, and Central Asia, with special interest in exchanges between Iran and China, aesthetic theory, and exhibition history. And the title of his talk this morning is The Birth of Art/Craft in Mid-19th Century Iran, Dialogues Between Subject, Medium, Composition. Please join me in welcoming David.
Okay, so good morning. I wanted to begin by thanking Claudia and Yukio for their invitation to join the conference, and also to the clerk, especially Caroline, for convening the event. And I wanted to also note at the outset that the work that I present today would not have been possible without the foundational research of Iranian scholars Shaher Adel, Abbas Amanat, Leila Diba, Maryam Ikhtiar, and Yahya Zoka. So long before the 1880s, artists in Iran had been exposed to the visual culture of European lands and ebbs and flows, at least since the period of the Mongol conquests of the mid-1200s. Artists, merchants, secular and religious envoys traveled from European lands with images in the form of printed books, oil paintings on panel and canvas, and works on paper. Artists in Iran not only assimilated, adapted, and recoded iconographic types and subject matters, like the nude, from a broad variety of European materials that they encountered, but they also engaged through formal means techniques of perspective, modeling, lighting effects, and other affects that simulated an enlivened image. These artistic engagements continued into the early modern and modern periods, when trade and political contacts between these cultural zones only increased, through a succession of mediums: metal engraving, xylography, lithography, photography, chromolithography, which were developed to serve as vehicles for the creation of images, which now held the potential for mass production and dissemination. These pen boxes of painted and drawn images under lacquer adapt European engravings as a blended technique of half-color, or neem kalam, alongside full polychrome, producing a partial memory of the material qualities of monochrome print. While this third example uses photographs, portraits of the Qajar ruler, princes, and advisors on the top side, with scenes of monuments from Tehran and Paris on the outer edges, glued onto the papier-mâché matrix of the box, then covered with an amber-hued lacquer, and completed with painted cartouche, arabesques, and calligraphy in gold and black, matched in hue to the varnished photographs. Another example of the material and physical transformation of cut and pasted European-sourced images is found in these ceiling panels of the Naranjistan Palace, the governor's residence in Shiraz, where a corpus of chromolithographs, female portrait busts, summer and winter landscape genre scenes is recast, repurposed amid geometric frameworks composed of cartouche, scrolls, floral bouquets, garlands, and vases. So examples such as these from Iran in the 1800s point up only a very few of the complex intermedial relationships that developed among new technologies of the print and the photograph at their intersections with the historical medium of painting, whether it was watercolor, oil, or pigment under lacquer. Fluidity of direct borrowing, imitation, adaptation, and intermediality, evidenced by artistic Iranian artistic practice en bloc were some of the many symptoms that stimulated the disparagement of European visitors who diminished the arts of modern Iran in their criticism. While this deep history of practice is not my concern today, it highlights crucial issues related to the ongoing arrival of European visual culture throughout the 1800s and the adaptation of European modes of pedagogy in Iran, chiefly at the Dar al-Funun, literally the Abode of Sciences, a polytechnic founded in December 1851 on the grounds of the Gulistan Palace, Tehran, the prime locus of Qajar dynastic power. The longue durée perspective of Persian artistic practice also highlights a structure through which to gauge the causal effects of the addition of painting to the curriculum of the Dar al-Funun in 1862 in light of what were then prevailing systemic conditions of artistic production. It's worth also emphasizing at the outset that the Dar al-Funun's curricular broadening, its embrace of painting in 1862, in itself followed 10 years after the innovation of a second new institution, the Dar al-Majma al-Sanai, the Arts and Crafts Complex, established in 1852 outside the palace and citadel walls in proximity to the commercial bazaar. The paired complementary institutions of the Dar al-Majma al-Sanai and Dar al-Funun followed on the heels of the sweeping military, bureaucratic, and social reforms initiated by the Grand Vizier Mirza Muhammad Taqi Khan Farahani, known simply as Amir Kabir, and his vision of a new order of Qajar society implemented in the early years of the reign of Nasir ad-Din Shah. He ruled 1848 to 96, who was in 1852 but a teenager. So this paper first introduces some of what we know about the Dar al-Funun and the Dar al-Majma al-Sanai, and then turns to an artist, Abul Hassan Ghafari, who played an outsized role in both institutions through study of his multivaried, multimedia artistic interventions. His roles as a painter in oil, watercolor, in lacquer, as a lithographer, and as a director and a teacher laid a foundation for the later history of Qajar Iran and determined many of its artistic outcomes. Even though recent scholarship has characterized this first start as a, quote, inauthentic modernism, largely because of the central role accorded to the reproductive arts in art making and pedagogy. So the Dar al-Funun was conceived by Amir Kabir as an institution that would propagate the useful sciences, preparing a new generation of Persians for work in the military, administration, and science, following developments in those fields of knowledge advanced in Europe. The original building, which is visible in the plan on the left here, was located inside the grounds of the walled citadel of the Gulistan Palace, with the outer walls of the city of Tehran visible in the plan on the right. So the original building of the Dar al-Funun was designed by a person named Mirza Reza Muhandis-Bashi, who had studied at the Royal Academy in Woolwich. As a court-centered building with 50 rooms arranged around it, its facades punctuated by iwans or broad arches. In its form, it resembled a historical Islamic theological college, a madrasa, an architectural typology that was also reflected in the early naming of the Dar al-Funun before its construction started. So construction was sufficiently advanced by December 1851 for the building to have its opening ceremony, but it took almost another year to complete the facilities. And at that point, it was a freestanding building located to the north of the palace grounds, but within the walls of the citadel, the Arg. The citadel abutted the northern wall, enclosing the city of Tehran. Over a number of years, other buildings were added to the walls bordering or in proximity to the Dar al-Funun, including the Akas Khane Mubaraki Humayuni, or the Blessed Imperial Photography House, in 1862, and an additional photography studio, a darkroom, and a pharmacy in 1867. These constructions were followed by other large-scale modifications to the palace ground that began in 1867, sponsored by the ruler Nasir ad-Din Shah. The principal subjects of the Dar al-Funun's curriculum in 1851 and after were infantry, cavalry, artillery, engineering, medicine, pharmacy, and mining, with preliminary instruction offered in mathematics, geography, history, and French. Refinements were continually made to the core curriculum, academic procedures, examinations, and administration, with the largest reorganizations initiated in 1860 under a new dean, the Qajar prince, Mirza Ali Qali Ittizada Sultana, whose intention was to broaden access to education across social ranks, increase the instrumental value of the subjects taught there, and shorten the time to degree from 12 to 5 years. A shift in emphasis away from military, engineering, and medical tracks now also occurred to embrace history, geography, painting, photography, which was under the chemistry department, music, English, German, and Russian. These years also witnessed a broad change away from an Austrian-dominated faculty to a French one. The primary objectives of painting at the Dar al-Funun, first led by Abul Hassan Ghafari in 1862, were to introduce principles of the European Academy by studying and copying works by Raphael, Titian, and Rembrandt, and to learn the technique of lithography. Photography played an important role in instruction, with photographs as well as plaster casts and models used as tools of pedagogy and as intermediary images in painting and lithography. Several copies of the European master's works made by Abul Hassan during an extended visit to Italy counted among the resources that were gathered at the Dar al-Funun. So the Dar al-Majma' al-Sana'i opened within months of the foundation of the Dar al-Funun in 1852 to promote the useful arts. It was located in an extant building of the Sabz Maidan. Tehran, further to the south. So you can see how the siting of the Dar al-Majma' al-Sana'i was in close proximity to this complex sequence of thoroughfares, shops, and caravanserais that made up Tehran's expansive commercial bazaar. Its physical location outside the palace signaled a new relationship between court-sponsored commodity production and the free enterprise of manufacture and commerce, suggesting a continuity between them. Before this time, art workshops funded by the court, generally named kitab khanes or kar khanes, were typically incorporated into the palace grounds and of reduced public visibility, and also regarded as part of the royal household, or the buyutati sultanati. As a collective of specialized modes of production, the Dar al-Majma' al-Sana'i was intended to promote native arts and crafts, printing, and their modes of pedagogy, as well as the marketing of their products. Aside from fostering the making of works on paper, encompassing single-sheet paintings, drawings, and calligraphies, and their composite formations as either manuscripts or albums, the Dar al-Majma' al-Sana'i also supported lacquerware, a carriage workshop, a watchmaker, a designer of military uniforms, and other accoutrements, as well as gun and sword makers. Its students worked according to historical master-apprentice models, through which students learned by example and practice, beginning with basic tasks of materials preparation and copying, and then moving up the ranks, ultimately to become masters if they were fortunate. While the Dar al-Majma' al-Sana'i's physical accessibility and proximity to the bar might have suggested its openness and institutional modernity, it was in fact largely devoted to the production of objects for private use by the Qajar elite, its court, as well as other elite members outside of the city of Tehran. So the chief protagonist in shifts of artistic production in the 1850s and the 1860s was this person, Mirza Abul Hassan Ghafari, who dies in 1867. a member of an illustrious family of statesmen and artists who hailed from the city of Kashan. In his early formation, spanning the late 1820s and early 1830s, he studied portraiture, oil, and watercolor under the court painter Meher Ali during the latter reigns of the reign of Fath Ali Shah and into the reign of his successor, Muhammad Shah. Abul Hassan's works from the period signal a growing familiarity with European painting. At some time before 1846, Abul Hassan was designated chief painter, Naqash Bashi, and despite his growing status, the dwindling commissions of the Qajar ruler Muhammad Shah probably stimulated his departure from Iran around 1847, a year before the accession of Nasir-ad-Din Shah and the vigorous reforms that were initiated by the Grand Vizier Amir Kabir. While Abul Hassan's journey to Europe appears to have been self-funded and of his own choosing, the factors that informed his decision remain elusive, as do many other aspects of his 3 to 4 year residency in Italy. We do not know, for example, his itinerary, or the collections that he studied, or the art academies he either visited or formally studied at. A later statement that was made in relation to Abul Hassan, however, concentrate on the artists Raphael, Michelangelo, and Titian, which in turn have generated Rome, the Vatican, Florence, and Venice as the most likely locations of his extended Italian travels. So, for example, in 1862, at the point where the Dar al-Funun added painting to its curriculum, there's a statement made that Abul Hassan Ghafari had copied works by these European masters, which, quote, received the approval of all his teachers. One such copy, made after Raphael's Vatican Madonna di Foligno, survived in Tehran up until the early 20th century, but its present whereabouts is unknown. So upon his return to Iran in 1850, he was reinstated in 1851 as the court painter and assigned a position at the State Gazette, the Ruzname-e Vakoi Intifaqiya. He was appointed the director of the Dar al-Majma al-Sanai and soon assigned the project of producing, under the latter's auspices, a multi-volume illustrated translation of the Arabic 1001 Nights. It was the first of several labor-intensive projects, royal commissions, undertaken through his leadership at the Dar al-Majma. The Arabic text of the 1001 Nights, the Alf Layla wa Layla, translated into Persian by Mullah Abdul Latif Tasuji, with poetry composed by Surush Isfahani as the Hizaru Yek Shab, took place over 2 years between 1843 and 1845, and some years later, the youthful Nasir-ad-Din Shah, titillated by the stories that were read to him through an oral version of the text, ordered a production of a written copy for his library. So the text was copied by Mirza Muhammad Hussein Tehrani in 1853. Meanwhile, a little bit earlier, a contract had been drafted between between Abul Hassan and Ustad Agha Naqash, who was the chief illuminator, defining a legal relationship between the producers of the manuscript and Hussein Ali Khan Mu'ayyar al-Mamalik, who was acting on behalf of the ruler, Nasir-ad-Din Shah. So it took some 3 years for the project to be completed under their direction, with Abul Hassan Ghafari leading the way. So he supervised a team comprising 42 artists of the book, painters, illuminators, rulers, and binders, following tried and tested deep historical models of manuscript production. In an alternating sequence of text folio and illustrated folio, the multi-volume work at its completion contained 1,134 pages of paintings, with each one composed of between 2 and 6 images. In its image compositions and alternating image text sequence, the book is modeled after the album, which was made up from formerly discrete artworks that were formed into fixed assemblages. So these examples on the screen show the arrangement of sequential narrative episodes from the stories stacked one on top of the other, enclosed by illuminated borders and introduced by short captions. Like many preceding examples of the illustrated book, the 1001 Nights engages techniques of picture-making from Iran, but integrates those with adaptations of the formal means of European print and painting, chiefly in the monochrome, modeled, stippled landscapes, volumetric modeled figures, perspectively or axonometrically rendered architecture scapes. Clothing and architecture were the chief signifiers of modernity. As was the custom, historical works of literature across genres were for the most part illustrated with contemporary costume and architecture rather than attempting an imaginary historical garb or urban setting. And Nasiruddin Shah and his courtiers further make appearances through characters in the stories. The tales made it possible to illustrate a broad spectrum of Qajar society, including its vagabonds and street vendors, and offered also a place for the representation of women, the restricted domestic spaces, and explorations of sexuality. After the completed manuscript was deposited in Nasiruddin Shah's library, it did not leave that private and restricted space. Another court-sponsored project came from Mirza Aga Khan Nuri Ittimad al-Dola, the Grand Vizier who succeeded Emir Kabir in 1852. By 1854, he'd completed construction of a new mansion for his son, Mirza Kazim Khan Nizam al-Mulk, on the southern side of the Nagaristan Palace. He commissioned a cycle of paintings in 1855, which were named after the house, the Nizamiya, and taking 2 years to complete, so by 1857, the 7 panels of oil and canvas were custom-made for the mansion and represented 94 figures, Nasiruddin Shah, his sons and other male relations, courtiers, ambassadors, dignitaries, and tribal chiefs, all gathered to celebrate the advent of the new year, the Nowruz. Thanks. Each canvas is composed of a sequence of standing figures, facing frontally and identifiable through distinct facial and bodily features, clothing, honors, medals, and textual labels. In preparing the paintings for the Dar al-Majma al-Sinai, Abul Ghafari made watercolors and drawings of the individuals, and these were passed on to his students for execution in oil. They added the heads to their respective bodies. Despite the shift in scale and medium, there's little to distinguish the oil painting cycle from the miniature paintings of the 1001 Nights. So as he supervised these projects, Abul Hassan continued to produce works on paper, mostly portraits of members of the court. The single-sheet portrait, mostly a single figure posed in an interior setting, was among the most common formats adopted by Qajar artists. It had a deep history in Persianate painting and had been thoroughly developed during the reign of Fath Ali Shah, whose early 19th century depictions showed the Qajar ruler in an interior space with any background architecture parallel to the picture plane. Spatial depth was sometimes suggested by the receding but also parallel lines of objects, such as a throne or a carpet, shown axonometrically, or by cutaway views from an interior to an exterior. Elements of painting tradition, long since adopted from European art, included an increased emphasis on the individual traits of physiognomy and the effects of light and shade, but none of these systems was applied systematically through the matrix of the image. Visible effects of light and shade or spatial recession were applied locally, affecting selected components of the image, and while the subject's face might suggest realism, intentional distortions in the proportions of the body reflected Qajar physiognomic ideals. So a group of single-page portraits of the 1850s, many of them by Abul Hassan Ghafari, demonstrate adaptations of these earlier Qajar paradigms. But rather than setting the figure in a space parallel to the pictorial space, the corner of the room is now frequently depicted, with a window opening, revealing an outdoor landscape, and the point of contact between the walls usually obscured by the sidr and furnishings. The framing of the image is tight and the space is tipped up, heightening a sense of intimacy and immediacy. The figure stands or sits in a setting that is decorated with lavish floor and wall coverings, painted dados with borders, and patterned drapes, and often furnished with a table and other objects. So in the interest of saving some time here, the chief point that I would make is that these paintings, while showing portraits of individuals, follow a kind of a blended pattern of Persianate painting construction that had long since adopted these modes of European representation, while at the same time using the photograph as a source for the physical contour of the body and also the treatment of the face and the hands. So you often find these very dramatic contrasts between the almost monochromatic rendering of the face and the hands and the polychrome treatment of the paintings. So amid all of these time-consuming, commissioned, and speculative projects, Abul Hassan continued his work in lacquerware, another art form that was fostered at the Dar al-Majma al-Sinai, and in lithography throughout the 1850s. He was appointed as editor of the official illustrated gazette of the Qajar state, the Ruzname-i Dawlat-i Ali Iran. Nasiruddin Shah's appointment letter described Abul Hassan's mastery in making lithographic images, which is, quote, one of the greatest arts and most difficult deeds. The pages of the Ruzname, some shown here, were illustrated with lithographed portraits of the Qajar elite, as well as important ceremonies of the court, based on watercolor sketches and worked-up images made by Abul Hassan. Despite statements made by the minister Itimad Sultana, there's ample evidence that Abul Hassan combined sketching from life with work after photographs in both his paintings and his lithographs. And as Farshid Imami has noted, the formation of an academy in 1862 was linked to the lithographic press and its, quote, pursuit of making more public use of images. Nasiruddin Shah's order for the creation of a state academy, the Naqash Khane Dawlati, headed by Abul Hassan, who was bestowed with the title Craftsman of the Kingdom, Sani al-Mulk, in 1861, combined lithographic facilities with 4 printing presses and painting studios. The primary purpose of the workshop was to publish government newspapers and flyers, but it also made copies after the works of famous European masters, which were sold and accepted ad hoc commissions for the reproduction of portraits. The text describing the concept and resources of the Academy were published in the Ruzname in April 1862, a few weeks before its formal opening. So as Mariam Ikhtiar has argued, the curriculum developed by Abul Hassan for painting at the Dar al-Funun adapted Persian systems of artistic pedagogy because it excluded life drawing, anatomy, geometry, and art theory. Ikhtiar also observes that learning through imitation and the value of replication were similar in the fine art-oriented Dar al-Funun and the craft-oriented Dar al-Majma al-Sinai. Although there was a division between institutions, principles and modes of artistic pedagogy were actually shared by them. Almost done. The sequence of developments in Iran in the 1850s and 1860s demonstrate an unquestionably strong degree of centralization in the formation of government institutions related to the practices of painting, photography, and lithography, and a robust connection between them. Continuity existed from the levels of administration to pedagogy and practice. It's also noteworthy that the very concept of craft was formed in Qajar domains in light of the effects of industrialization and in the face of new technologies of the image. Iran, like so many other places in the world, developed the concept of craft and indigenous practice in the 1800s. There's ample evidence to indicate that artists made lithographs from paintings, engravings, and photographs, and that paintings in turn were made from photographs and prints, both engravings and lithographs. It was also possible to directly use actual prints and photographs in the manufacture of objects. Within this setting, photography and lithography were the chief signifiers of modernity, and many other art forms were reorganized in relationship to them. The central importance of photography and lithography at the Dar al-Funun corresponded also to the demands of a newly developing state news apparatus, which produced illustrated newspapers through the lithographic press. It is the larger and continued role of the reproductive medium that has often prompted criticism of the local modernity supported by the Qajar elite in Tehran in the 1850s and 1860s. In some measure, this can be explained by adaptations to pedagogy in response to social restrictions, the impossibility of life drawing. But in any case, the 1800s were little different in Iran in earlier centuries for the way in which artists made images from images, a process that was unencumbered by the advent of new mediums or notions of any distinctions between them. Thank you.
Our second speaker this morning is Kirsten Scheid, who's an associate professor of anthropology at the American University of Beirut. She writes about imagination technologies, affect, social change, and art historiography in cross-cultural encounters. The title of our talk this morning is Semites, Lady Artists, or Partisans of the Nude? The Struggle for an Art Academy in Mandate, Lebanon. Please join me in welcoming Kirsten.
I want to start by expressing my gratitude to Yukio Lippit, Claudia Mattos, Carolyn Fowler for the invitation, and also to Sam Page and Deb Fair for logistics help. So, among the urgent files sitting in June 1943 on the Beirut desk of the new ambassador, general, and plenipotentiary of France to the Levant was a proposal for an Academy of Fine Art. Nobody wanted to deal with it. Deferrals piled up in the file. This was not the first time the issue had been raised to the Ministry of Public Instruction since the founding of the French mandate over Lebanon and Syria in 1920. All knew the matter was delicate. Although an Académie Libanaise des Beaux-Arts had been decreed in March 1931 and a director appointed, by 1943 there still was no establishment by that name, and the director was, on the contrary, arrested for teaching without a license. That summer, the director of Painting at Istanbul's Academy of Fine Arts, Leopold Lévy, had pledged his support for a Lebanese sister institution, noting that the detailed curriculum plans showed that the proposed academy followed closely the, quote, traditional teaching structure of an École des Beaux-Arts, end quote, as Lévy put it. Yet officials had already rejected a similar proposal by the expatriate painters Michelet and Lecoq de la Frémondière on the grounds that the painters' minimal talent would expose French interests to ridicule among French and Lebanese painters and in the public arena, as one bureaucrat scathed. French renown in the arts was at stake, but so was France's civilizing mission, which in the case of Syria and Lebanon, historians have shown, was the empire's only legitimation for continued control after 20 years of flagrantly exploitative colonization. Histories of art in Lebanon and other former colonies tend to take for granted the introduction of art lessons to the wider public as part of a colonial curriculum, and to focus on the top-down power that art lessons allegedly imposed on the imaginations and identifications of colonized peoples. Their findings, however, are mired in a model that treats power as a possession and art as a reflection. I want to pursue what anthropologist Fred Myers calls a local art history. Such a history forms through interactions, not mere application of models. It tends to have unexpected geneses that accumulate unpredictable associations, as I think David's talk just shows too. Pursuing a local history can remind us of social connections often overlooked. My second task in this talk is to consider how, over the course of the decade, the professionalization of art became gendered. I argue that working out ideas about art amounted to working out ideas about gender and civic bonds, a process I call self-civilizing for how it drew from but redirected colonial discourses of civilizational merit. Considering students' interactions with art lessons, and particularly the imported genre of the nude, will help us understand the gap that came to emerge between mandate citizens and their colonial teachers. Mustafa Farooq, who was born in 1901, died in 1957 in Beirut, preserved this image in his Snapshots album. It positions the elegantly suited art student before an easel pinned with his penciled sketch of two male nudes. He carries a palette of oil pigments as if to commence painting over the sketch. The choice to preserve this moment in the artistic process affirms the importance of drawing from life to his art. Born as an Ottoman subject, Farooq had become a French colonial citizen by the time he sailed to Rome in 1924. Like many, he developed a discourse blaming Ottomans for the civilizational backwardness, quote unquote, that allowed his peers, his would-be countrymen, to be occupied by the French. He held that liberation would occur with self-development, including civilizational and spiritual development, refinement, as well as economic and political strengthening. To this end, Farooq and his supporters frequently told of an encounter he had as a child with self-proclaimed religious scholars who, he said, quote, told me that on Judgment Day I was going to have to put souls for each of my drawings, or I would be thrown into hell, end quote. The child was dissuaded entirely from drawing until an enterprising sheikh, Mustafa al-Ghalaini, promised to personally take on that task. Quote, you picture them, I will put the souls, end quote. Farooq's figural works are thus co-productions with an innovative sheikh pitting himself with the pupil against religious opponents. In the wake of the Ottoman bureaucracy's retreat, new and renewed ideas about Islam circulated the region and debate proliferated. They were pitted not against an external invading imposing force, but rather for the active production of Islam. Some ideas about the active production of Islam involved visuality to discover avenues of worship. Viewing this photograph, we may focus on the suit, tie, and other signs of individual accomplishment or even westernization. But Farooq's physical alignment could remind his viewers and himself that behind the proud artist was the study of nature. As an established artist, Farooq came to describe drawing as an act of prayer. He recounted for a 1947 audience in Beirut how he once found his mentor, the prominent portraitist Habib Sroor, fervently sketching a wizened tree branch. Sroor declared that he took a position of humility to study the wisdom and secrets, their structure, and the interlocking of its parts, just as an adherent kneels at a mihrab, reads a holy book, or chants hymns to know and acknowledge the divine power and creativity. End quote. Or again, in an essay titled Art and Religion, and widely republished, Farooq wrote, verily, the mission of art is to unveil for us all that is beautiful in nature and what lies hidden in its innermost folds by way of secrets, dazzling marvels, and signs of the divine, which would be ayat bayanat in Arabic, for these bring us closer to the miracles and glories of the mind-blowing agency behind this existence. Praises be to God, the most splendid of creators. The language Farooq deploys for divine visuality defines his drawing of undressed human bodies as acclamations of the hikmah, or divine knowledge, invested in the most mundane of elements. Seeing the medium of anatomical study this way allows us to appreciate these works as prayers to a creator and not merely as certificates of professional accomplishment. Let us consider further the interactions that formed this history of the nude and eventually a local academy of art. Farouk recounts that seeing a naked female model in his first live drawing class in Rome overwhelmed him with arousal. Trembling in confusion, Farouk was equally embarrassed. He was equally embarrassed that he seemed to be the only person not controlling his appendages, and what is an artist without a steady hand? He left the room momentarily, returning after he had scolded himself to accomplish a few broad lines. That night, after a punishingly cold shower, he writes about all of this in his autobiography, and still feeling confused, Farouk found a better solution. He read the Quran. Praise the Lord. Reading a few select passages from the Holy Quran had a decisive effect. Thus, I joined conviction and therapy, stony will and duty. I reached a decent balance. I emerged from the battle safely. The next day, the difference was plain, the result better. Indeed, I realized that the day I passed the Royal Academy's entrance exam and thanked God who inspired in me this progress. There is no success but by God. So, essentially, Farouk asserts that only pious artists can succeed. The sketches that he repeatedly produced steadily and piercingly followed the musculature, skin tension, and spilling rolls of their sitters because his eye acknowledges divine creation in them. Just as his childhood figure drawings were co-productions with the congenial sheikh, these sketches were co-productions with the artist and the artist, as Farouk sometimes referred to divine power. They announced his achieving both professional status and equally committed piety. They placed him in the academy, but also in Dar al-Islam, or the realm of God on earth. Now, to understand the spread of social investment in art training that would propel demand for an art academy, I contrast the young Mustafa Farouk's experience with that of his later pupil, Salwa Raud Shu'air, who was born in 1916 and just died in 2017, also lived in Beirut most of her life. You might have seen her retrospective at the Tate Modern in 2014. Shu'air attended Ahliya School for Girls from 1924 to 1936. Following the establishment of the Mandate of Lebanon and Syria in 1920, the French High Commissioner had total responsibility for school administration. In the fall of 1924, when Shu'air enrolled at Ahliya, the director of public instruction in Mandate France issued decrees on the teaching of arts and handicrafts in Lebanese schools. Importing a curriculum from colonial Morocco, French authorities offered drawing lessons for cultivating le compas d'un l'œil, or an ocular compass, what historian Hamid Erbouh interprets as a sort of generalizable self-regulation, developed to pacify and indigenize artisans who would retain their, quote, religious traditions, i.e. iconoclasm, end quote, and stay out of politics, in other words, avoid anti-colonialism. The ocular compass opposed both self-expression and fine art. One decree proclaimed that the goal of teaching handicrafts to nursery school children was to, quote, establish constant and direct contact between the child and the objects surrounding him in view of developing his manual skills, his senses, and through these to awaken his intellect, end quote. Another decree specified that boys should learn drawing, girls sewing. A third clarified that the goal of teaching drawing in the elementary schools was to instill, quote, the use of perspective, a sense of landscape, and respect for classical models, end quote. Note that no decrees dealt with training beyond grade 6, for French allocated art training only to age 12. Ahliya School was regulated by the Mandate educational decrees, but it combined them with additional classes and extended their length to offer a nationalist, as it called it, curriculum for raising, quote, modern women, end quote, who could contribute in equal measure to their homes and homeland. Students learned history, math, life sciences, nursing, home management, literature in Arabic, French, and English, and, quote, all the fine arts, end quote. So, side note, music was taught here, and this is where that director was arrested for teaching it. To teach arts, Ahliya utilized pedagogies common in Britain and France, which included the fine arts and especially drawing, to channel girls' presumed natural appreciation of beauty and imitative nature into time-consuming, quiet, modest activity. This production of the lady artist, or Sayyida Fannana, accorded with French decrees, yet, treating girls as transitive agents of aesthetic sensibility, Ahliya refashioned the very limits of domestic space to merge personal, familial, and national concerns. Historian Elizabeth Thompson terms their project patriotic motherhood. It's a femininity cultivated through exposure to intellectual, sensual, and practical resources that can ultimately uphold a new national body. The lady artist was integral to this project. Khullar recalls that she learned to sew aprons, follow recipes for English cakes and Arabic stews, decorate serving trays, and groom herself, lessons she continued to apply as an adult. However, she hated drawing lessons, which were introduced in the 8th year. According to an oft-repeated tale, Khullar innately enjoyed sketching her classmates and teachers and received plentiful encouragement, so unlike Farrukh, but when it came time to copy classical pictures using the grid transfer method, Khullar stubbornly refused and spent the entire lesson each week outside the classroom door. Now, I just want to note that she actually did at some point stay in the classroom because these are preserved pictures. Her brother kept these. He liked this work, not the work that she became later famous for. So the arc from Mustafa, the little Muslim boy who could draw, to Salwa, a secular but pious girl who should draw, reminds us that people invested in art to control the population, and they contested, structured, and restructured forms of authority through its medium. That Farrukh's early sketches received shelter in Sheikhly breath, I'll put the souls was literally supposed to be breathing them in, suggest that a young boy's attempts literally inspired and audacious rereadings of social hierarchies and the sacred texts authorizing them. That a disobedient Khullar could be banned from the curriculum for learning femininity and nationality suggests much was still at stake in mandate classrooms. This is an important prehistory to the struggle over the Lebanese Academy for Fine Art that was to come to a head in 1943. While drawing became increasingly modern and important for modernizing, it also became gendered in a contrary way. The transitive role allotted to women in the arts not only demanded an educational program for females that gave greater attention to aesthetic matters, but rendered women natural artists. This logic suggested lady artists were less intellectual, akin to artisans. Moreover, the emphasis on the social benefit of their art could suggest that their creative production was not truly art, in a Kantian sense of purposelessness. Indeed, this abjection encompassed all art produced in the nationalist crucible for social good. Even male artists were feminized by it. Could one be a native and an artist? Now, the key to answering in the affirmative for Farrukh and his peers lay in practicing live drawing and the nude genre, which were for them the emblems of professional academic training in art and the epicenter of a social reform program. I've written elsewhere about the deployment of the nude genre as a technique of modernity and self-civilizing. Here I review a few points. Contra art historiographical hype about the alleged impossibility of the nude for Arabs and Muslims, painters active in the Ottoman Beirut territory had decades of experience, if not more, with live drawing and produced publicly shared nudes. Just to give one example, Farrukh's teacher, Habib Surur, who taught at the Ottoman College, employed a live model and produced a plethora of oil paintings of that model and of men as well. Even before Farrukh reached Rome, nudes populated his sketchbooks, possibly based on Surur's compositions. Secondly, throughout the 1920s and 30s, nudes continued to be produced and displayed in public exhibitions as signs of international peership. Thirdly, and this deserves some elaboration, the genre's production related to a social movement called by its adherents Ansar al-Uri, or partisans of the nude. Now, primarily a nudist movement, the partisans of the nude congealed around a 1930 handbook titled Rasul al-Uri, which still gets, it's still produced and sometimes accidentally bought by Saudis who think they're getting Rasul al-Arab. So the prophet of the nude is what this title means, and the translation, it's a loose translation by Fuad Habesh, Several Arabic newspapers provided fora for discussing nudism's benefits, and in 1934, Hubert Schonger's La Marche au Soleil, portraying life in a German nudist colony, played at Beirut's Olympia Cinema. The following year, Al-Habeish founded Al-Makshuf newspaper. The title means uncovered or revealed. Its contents help us grasp the convergences that partisans of the nudes experienced and how an academy with live models could become socially urgent. Amidst pornographic imagery and literature, political and art criticism also abounded, the latter focusing on nude paintings, but also addressing nudist writing, literary uncovering of social truths. The nudist movement, the nude genre, and nudist writing all share the Arabic term uri, which references nakedness more as a state of being than an object. Uri is what historian Monique Scheer calls an emotional practice, action undertaken to achieve desired emotions and modify undesired ones. Partisans of the nude held that regular exposure to naked bodies developed balanced emotions of respect and refinement. The exercise was thus civic and publicly engaged. One 1930 article invokes Lycurgus of Sparta's promotion of nudism to counter shame and fear among young women. Another report on schools from 1931 concludes with the question, quote, "When will we in the East feel this need to strengthen our youth from its very beginning, that we might make of it a generation of the future, strong, courageous, and freed from all kinds of maladies," end quote. Clearly, the authors were not waiting for the feeling to percolate. They were investing in emotions' emergence by describing, reproducing, and creating encounters with nudes. This point of emotional self-management should recall Farrukh's story of encountering the live model in Rome. And he has other stories like this, which have circulated, are very popular too. Indeed, painted renditions of nudes offered practice at such encounters. Notice in these paintings by Omar Unsi, born 1901, died 1969 in Beirut, a colleague of Farrukh's, and also a teacher of Khullar, that the figures, does this thing, actually, I don't know how to do this. Like that? Okay, so the figures here that these women are looking at are not just nude, but they're in academy or classroom poses, right? And here, this is supposed to be Imru Qais looking at Unaiza and her friends, and you see how each one turns just as a woman, as a model would, to show different sides of her body. So they are not just nude, but they embody classroom postures, and they convey the Academy's promise of self-refinement to engaged audiences. And in 1932, these two pictures hung right next to each other, very clearly contrasting ways that people could look at the nude and be looked at for looking at the nude. So Alma Unsi's compositions of ways of looking at the nude, which I've discussed at length elsewhere, give a sense of the urgency of an academy in which the nude triggers a necessary leap from impiety, which is what Imru Qais would stand for, to good Islam, from Ottoman backwardness to self-discovery and civilization. So these images return us finally to the campaign for an Academy of Fine Art. The file on the plenipotentiary's desk accumulated nervous notes secretaries sent between their masters' offices until the man with the longest local knowledge, Gabriel Bonheur, returned from summer holidays. Bonheur was first posted to the Levant in 1923, and since 1937 had served the double role of Inspector General for the Œuvre Française and the advisor to the High Commission for Public Instruction. Arabophone literary scholars today celebrate his patronage of Algerian, Lebanese, and Egyptian writers and poets, yet Bonheur was ambivalent about visual arts among Arabs. And actually, I find resonance of this with contemporary curators. What's that? 5 minutes, okay. All the paintings I've shared with you appeared at privately initiated exhibitions. That French authorities did not actively support professional painting in the mandated territories caused many minor scandals. Bureaucratic archives bespeak a mixed desire to use art to illustrate the beneficence of French presence and to resist spending money on the arts or losing control over aesthetic standards. In this context, Bonheur's response to the Academy's application is striking for its unequivocality. The letter makes an astonishing read today. September 8th, 1943, the envisaged foundation seems to me devoid of the least interest, except evidently for those aspiring to find employment there. I'll continue reading it. Not only are the populations of these Semitic countries little gifted in the plastic arts, but moreover, these territories are too small and too poor for such an institution to be justified. 5 million inhabitants, of which a large number are nomads and illiterates, can easily forgo a school of fine arts. There are many Lebanese painters, and even Syrian ones. They live in hardship. They have repeatedly attempted to incite the public powers to establish a school where they would find a means of livelihood. The projects have failed each time because the absence of all serious basis has condemned them fatally to failure. Anyway, it would not be possible to put the case under direction of a foreigner. We would have an immediate mobilization of local painters and sculptors, at the head of which would be Madame Aveline Bustros and several of the highest authorities of the land. The only useful creation, it strikes me, would be that of an office of local arts, proposing to reanimate, vivify, and transform moribund techniques and an artisanry in plain decadence. Signed, Bonheur. As I mentioned in the opening, the detailed curriculum plans showed that the students were going to learn, quote, the history of art and civilization, end quote, and study the same techniques as their French counterparts in Paris. Now, what Bonheur saw merely as inventing jobs, the artists and audiences petitioning repeatedly for a Lebanese Academy of Fine Arts seem to have seen as creating an environment, a social condition to rise from, quote, the sandy desert to the lofty skies of international art, as one visitor had put it in Faroukh's guest registry in 1933. Lebanese students' road to becoming professional Lebanese artists would commence, according to this vision, from establishing them as contemporary artists, inhabiting the shared end of a teleological history, making fine art with the nude would move time forward. Bonheur met this request for contemporaneity with a condemnation to locality. Everything about this locale was too small, the people little gifted in the arts, their land tiny, their population limited. Mired in placidness, teleological time could not have positive effect here. Repeated attempts to found a school had not accumulated and built a ladder history could climb. And whenever foreigners tried to help, they were confronted with localist sentiment. In such a place, there was no future for contemporaneity. The best that could be hoped for was to rescue the local, which for the French were the signs of obvious difference in lifestyle techniques, to rescue it from its decay and backwardness. Ultimately, Bonheur reduced the aspiring artists to artisans and attached to them the racial identity of Semites, whose inability to be professional artists, well, ça va sans dire, right? So 3 days after Bonheur's response was drafted, Riyad al-Soleh declared the Lebanese independent state, and within a month, a French counter-coup had been rebuffed. This was the end of the French mandate. 3 months later, the Académie Libanaise des Beaux-Arts opened. In closing, I want to indicate some of the ironies relating particularly to gender, nationalism, and ethnicity in this episode. This academy, called ALBA and still existent today, was conceived in the model of metropolitan colonial art pedagogy, but it was rejected by colonists. While the colonial conception of art training limited to 6 years, effectively feminizing the East, feminists and nationalists cultivated an understanding of universal art to launch an institution on par with the French professional art institution art system. And though this institution first received shelter at the feminist institution, Ahliye, it ultimately gave priority to professionalizing male artists. Before the art world's professionalization in Beirut, female practitioners formed a significant and well-supported portion. That was to dwindle. Only one professional female joined ALBA, the director's cleaning lady, turned nude model. Colonizers and decolonials had come to agree on the gender and temporality of art. Thank you.
Our third speaker this morning is Deniz Türker. She is the Leverhulme Early Career Fellow at the University of Cambridge, and in September 2020, she will join the Department of Art at Rutgers. She's a historian of Islamic art and architecture. She specializes in 19th century Ottoman visual culture. Her research and publications range from non-Western collectors of Islamic art to Ottoman photography, imperial archiving practices, landscape design, and mail-order prefabs. And the title of her talk this morning is Bureaucrat Artists of the Ottoman State, 19th Century Art Practices Beyond the Sanayi Nefise. Please join me in welcoming Deniz.
Here we are. Okay, let me also join my co-panelists in thanking the organizers, Caroline, Claudia, Yukio, and the wonderful Clark staff for howling me from London over. And it's an immense privilege to be here among you today. So, the much rehearsed history of how the Ottoman Imperial School of Fine Arts, Mektebi Sanayi Nefise-i Şahane, came into being in Istanbul in the early 1880s is as follows. After trial runs over a decade to formulate an art academy in various guises and initiated by various state ministries, all through the collaborative personal efforts of high-level statesmen and artists, the school was founded under the steady leadership of Osman Hamdi Bey, the Orientalist artist, archaeologist of Mount Nemrud and Sidon, and famed director of the Ottoman Antiquities Museum. Here on the left, he's reclining over the bust of an ancient Hellenic god in southeastern Anatolia, and on the right is his well-known enigmatic self-portrait as a dervish. State ministries took this initiative to educate the public in the arts as a key component of the radical administrative, legal, and cultural period of reforms known as the Tanzimat, reorderings. It's translated to reorderings. These reforms not only transformed structures of the state, but had top-down effects on the Muslim and non-Muslim subjects and cultures of the empire throughout the 19th century. The Levantine architect Alexander Valori, a civil servant tasked by the state with architectural commissions, designed a compact neoclassical building, this one here, decorated with assertive pilasters and Gorgon reliefs, situated across from the Museum of Antiquities. The Art Academy had a simple plan to accommodate 5 spacious ateliers, and the atelier that you're seeing on the right is the architecture atelier. Valori was also soon appointed the school's architecture instructor in architecture. The neighboring Antiquities Museum had already been installed, let's go here, in the 15th century tiled pavilion, this structure here. And so the academy is this building here, and the tiled pavilion is right here. So the neighboring Antiquities Museum had already been installed in the 15th century tiled pavilion on the largely vacated grounds of the Topkapı Palace. The wooded part of the old palatial complex, once a hunting ground, was emerging in the 19th century as a heavily landscaped museological center of the capital. So you're going to have to imagine these two structures here for a decade without this one here, which ends up being the Imperial Museum, the Archaeological Museum. So you have to imagine these two structures on their own with a big wooded, heavily landscaped park in front of them. The Academy Museum link, their physical and intellectual proximities, was deliberately structured on the European academic tradition. Students would have the privilege of observing and drafting from primarily Hellenic antiquities, which were amassed inside the tiled pavilion from all corners of the empire as a centralized effort to turn Istanbul into a cultural capital. Osman Hamdi, the mastermind of all things cultural, naturally shared the directorship of these two interlinked institutions. And here's another photograph of the Room of Bronzes. Here you go. Inside the tile pavilion, in which the students of the academy often sketched, because the room had most of these sort of fragmentary body parts in bronze, rather than plaster casts. It's important to emphasize the point here that these types of endeavors, though intended as a civic good, were propelled by individual initiatives and always had rough, under-budgeted inaugurations. It was Hamdi Bey's intellectual alliance with the then Minister of Trade, Raif Pasha, that expedited his petitions to the Sultan, Abdülhamid II, who gave them the go-ahead. Therefore, strangely, while the Imperial Museum, of which Osman Hamdi was the director, was financed by the Ministry of Education, the new school's operations were under the jurisdiction of the Ministry of Trade. The latter modeled, an archival document tells us, on the organizational principles of European trade ministries. What's often overlooked in Ottoman institutional historiography is that the Academy's inaugural memorandum is surprisingly close to the tenets of the English arts and crafts movement, and not the French academic model of training in the arts. Lamenting the loss of interest in artisanal craft and attributing such local neglect to industrial designs imported from Europe, the memorandum calls for a return to craft traditions and the preservation of ancestral monuments. In many ways, this type of proto-national sentiment of a loss of heritage was a continuation of the strategy that the Ottoman statesmen, including Osman Hamdi, emphatically used in their contributions to the 1873 Vienna exhibition, the famous costume album and volume on the history of Ottoman architecture, of which I present photographic and architectural plates here. You actually see right here a potter's family, an artisan's family from Yanina, on the left-hand side from the costume albums, and an image of a 15th century, an early Ottoman mosque in Bursa, and its mukarnas detailing. So these two volumes that were exhibited at this exhibition were put together with the sole aim of highlighting and reviving a distinctly medieval, read Gothic, Ottoman past, which was artisanal, hence moral, rational, and demographically heterogeneous. It's quite likely then that the School of Fine Arts was under the jurisdiction of the Ministry of Trade due to the school's formation as an institution that was hoped would elevate Ottoman design to the level of European objects exhibited at world's fairs and traded internationally. It's also important to add, however, that the anxiety over the loss of artisanal work and the influx of foreign goods were also beginning to be curbed by an empire-wide emergence, here we go, of the schools of arts and crafts, sanayi mektepleri. And the one that you're seeing here is from Istanbul, from the capital, of the two carpentry ateliers in the School of Arts and Crafts. And here the subtitle reads, it's the carpentry atelier that produces the furniture in Arab architectural style. So if you look closely, you'll see horseshoe-arched desks and chairs and, all sorts of Alhamresque and Memluk, sort of neo-Oriental furniture being produced. The Istanbul branch of this arts and crafts school was opened at exactly the same year, 1883, as the School of Fine Arts, with the aim of training the same age group of 15 to 25-year-olds. From its inception, the School of Fine Arts, the Sanayi Nefise, had to compete with other state-sponsored vocational schools, not only for funds, but also in delineating exactly the type of student it would train. This fact, I think, is significant to understand, as the notions of high versus low art, or high versus applied arts, were not so clearly articulated in the late 19th century, at the very least among high-level bureaucrats with intellectual aspirations and input on the formation of these schools. It was a decade or so later that this differentiation was made to the point where graduates of the schools of arts and crafts that showed exceptional promise were given spots in the Academy of Fine Arts to advance their artistic talents. The Ottoman Fine Arts Academy would instruct students in painting, sculpture, architecture, and engraving. They had to hold a high school diploma, and the school began with 20 mostly non-Muslim students. In 5 years, the number of enrollees would go up to 60 and reach its maximum number at 195 in 1894, most of whom were not full-time members. As Mustafa Cezar, one of the earliest scholars to study the institutional history of art of the Ottoman Empire through archival work shows, the school was fairly modest in what it offered in terms of its curriculum, as well as the size of its faculty. The instructors were conceived of as heads of individual ateliers, an instructor on oil painting, on engraving, architecture, and sculpture. And sculpture, mind you, was rendered in the Ottoman as carver, oymacı, and not sculptor, heykeltıraş, which would become a kind of a word that they would pick up in the Turkish Republican years to describe a sculptor. The school also employed a draftsman, a scribe, and a guard for the museum and library. And here's a group photograph of the first members of the academic campus with the instructors seated. Here, Osman Hamdi Bey at the center, Alexander Valori, the architect, Zernia Varvika, the engraver, Salvatore Valori, the painter, and Oskan Efendi, the oymacı, the carver, the sculptor, and then the students. Of course, they're all men, but they're quite interestingly framed by two Greco-Roman female figures, some students replicating the hand gestures of the sculptures, perhaps reflecting the school's future aspirations to become co-ed. The school's regulations stipulated that history, decorative arts, and a course on antiquities were obligatory for all students, while the first year's courses were shared among the 4 practical divisions, and they were the history of art, ornamentation, perspective, condensed arithmetic, geometry, bookkeeping, antiquities, and anatomy. History and theory-based courses were outsourced to public intellectuals such as Mehmet Vahid Efendi, who was a graduate of the Imperial Military School, and Osman Hamdi's son-in-law. The operating budget of the school was quite minimal. The bureaucratic archives contain many petitions by Osman Hamdi for various expenses, from expanding the school grounds to more faculty hires. And we know from the memoirs of Fausto Zonaro, the Italian painter who occasionally worked as court painter to Sultan Abdülhamid II, that some of the Ottoman Greek students from the academy sought extra drafting sessions from him. Zonaro asked them to make plaster casts of their bodies to practice from in a makeshift rented atelier. That in many ways, this Francophile art academy, lionized in Ottoman art historical scholarship alongside its founder, Osman Hamdi, was actually not prioritized by the Sultan or by higher administrative organs of the state, is worth mentioning as an oft-neglected fact. Buildings' expansions and ensuring its contents occurred only 2 decades later. Some early Turkish Republican scholars have attributed the reason for the Academy's marginalization to Osman Hamdi's exclusion of already successful Muslim artists in the faculty body. Others have argued that it was pre-existing state-endorsed schools, exclusive to the empire's Muslim subjects, that took priority in the government's budget. And the curricula of these schools already included advanced arts training, which I will touch upon shortly. And not to be forgotten, while the Antiquities Museum's fame and popularity grew both internationally and globally, the first few graduates of the adjacent academy did not garner any domestic renown. Some with connections to in the diaspora found success in Greece and Italy, while the handful of Muslim Turkish students found gainful employment in the photographic studios or printing presses in the capital. These rare photographs here are of one of the earliest exhibitions that the Academy housed, and on display are mostly Christian Orthodox genre scenes, where the Ottoman Greek student Nikolaos Alektoridis, an artist who would later find relative fame in Greece and Egypt, was given prime of place. In fact, the Academy's success as a co-educational and prodigious fine arts school starts in the Turkish Republican years, which would later be absorbed into the Mimar Sinan University of Fine Arts that is still in operation today. And here, what you have here is of the early Turkish Republican years of the Academy as a co-educational institution of both men and women attending life drawing classes. Only recently, Research that I undertook for an exhibition revolving around a set of newly discovered photograph albums prepared by Sultan Abdülhamit II for the German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck has led me to consider the artistic output of individuals who had received a different sort of artistic training, one that preceded the establishment of the Academy of Fine Arts. These albums depicted landscapes, monuments, and ethnographic types of mostly semi-nomadic populations of central Anatolia. They were initially shot under an imperial decree that solicited the surveying of a newly created sub-province named after the empire's progenitor, Ertuğrul. So let me just orient you a little bit. Istanbul is right here. This entire region was a very important province of the Ottoman Empire called the Hüdavendigar province. In the late 19th century, Sultan Abdülhamit decided that he was going to create a completely new sub-province in this beautiful lilac-colored region here, and he would name it after the progenitor of the empire, right? So. Sultan Abdülhamit's plan in creating this sub-province was twofold. One, to codify an imperial ideology around the empire's founding in the late 13th century by formulating rituals and hence inventing traditions around ancient sites in this region. And second, to economically energize the region by laying down a railway network that would later be extended bidirectionally from Berlin to Baghdad. These albums as diplomatic gifts to Bismarck marked the end of a successful bargain to convince the newly unified German Empire to finance part of this grand project. The photographs captured all the towns that would become stations along this hypothetical railway line, with extensive subtitles that relayed both historical and contemporary demographic information about what photograph you were looking at. The surveying mission was given to 12 instructors assembled from the Imperial School of Land Engineering, that is Mühendishane-i Berri Humayun, and the Military Academy, Mektebi Harbiye. Here are 5 of the most prominent members of the surveying team, posed in beautiful triangular hierarchy. One at the center, the main photographer, is Sururili Ahmet Emin. And then this figure here would become one of the most important Ottoman artists, Hoca Ali Riza, Master Ali Riza. And then this gentleman here is Shekur Efendi, who would also become a renowned painter. And what you have here is the journey they took on foot, no railway lines at that point, on foot and occasionally on horseback from Istanbul to Bursa all the way down to central Anatolia, Eskişehir. This expedition team traversed these lands on horseback and on foot with cameras, with surveying tools, glass negatives, and sketch pads, climbed peaks and rocky terrains, measured, sketched, and photographed for 2 weeks in April 1886. On their return to Istanbul, they presented the Sultan with a vast portfolio of mostly visual documentation, including no longer extant relief maps, as well as extant photographs, pencil sketches, and oil paintings. They also wrote a long imperial memorandum on their findings, ranging from the ethnic composition, habits, and even speech samples of the nomadic inhabitants or semi-nomadic inhabitants of these towns to the principal raw materials that were produced in this region. The semi-nomadic tribes that they chose to foreground for this survey became the first ethnographic subjects of the Ottoman state. Of course, there's a lot more to say on the earliest example of imperial Turkification, but for the purposes of this presentation, I would like to stress the fact that imperial commissions such as these were consistently commissioned to such state-funded and military-trained Muslim bureaucrat artists. Another project that a collective from these two schools undertook, just to show you the range of representations and media in which they were able to work, is this unrealized project of a railway line with a proper imperial wagon conceived for the Sultan's palace and garden complex of Yıldız. This time, the project's portfolio contained a physical map of the layout of the railway line, The site's carefully measured topographic gradient, elevation of 2 projected bridges that the wagon would cross, as well as the cross-section of the wagon and its neo-Ottoman picturesque interior, replete with textiles produced in the imperial ateliers. Contemporary archiving practices have made it difficult to identify complete sets of these imperial projects done by military artists, as well as the fact that most of the extant visual material has the imprint of the schools rather than individual autographs of their members. However, we can perhaps surmise that the watercolor interior of the imperial wagon, so rich in detail, was undertaken by Major Ali Riza, or Hoja Ali Riza, the gentleman to the very far end of the expedition survey photograph, the most lauded and prolific Muslim artist of the late Ottoman Empire, who, as I said, was part of the surveying expedition that I mentioned. Concise histories of these schools, much overlooked by art historians because the books are really, they're big, they're about 600 pages each and unillustrated, so it becomes a kind of mundane task to go through. But concise histories of these two schools, were written down by Captain Mehmet Esad, a member of the military academy in the late 1890s. Here you have the one on the land engineering school, Mirat-ı Mühendisani Bedi Humayun, and the one on the Imperial Military School on the right. He dwells considerably on the art training and individual biographies of the military artists, closely following the Persian and later Ottoman traditions of artist biographies. But in equal measure, these texts also serve as proto-yearbooks. You can identify the entry year of a member and his graduation, and then where he ended up going. The founding of these two schools were related to the earliest phase of Ottoman reforms that were initiated under Selim III at the turn of the 19th century and directed at updating the military. The Land Engineering School was founded in 1796, while the Military Academies was founded in 1835. The curricula of these schools were closely aligned. Rigorous military training and formations aside, the students took physics, geometry, algebra, chemistry, ballistics, and gunnery. But of equal importance were perspective, menazır, hatching, tarama, shading, gölgeleme, principles of architectural drawing, anatomy, cartography, topography, art theory and practice, the latter referred to as resim, lithography, and later photography. Calligraphy as well as Arabic and Persian training were also obligatory. We have photographs here of an outdoor architecture class on the top left, as well as one on the right, where the students are studying the history of Ottoman arms and armor. The schools were tasked with raising military personnel with a merit-based ranking system, who were also intended to hold bureaucratic day jobs in state institutions such as the State Foundry, Arsenal, railway, ferry and steamship lines, building works, imperial mapping projects, and state printing presses. They would also be given instructional positions in the empire-wide military preparatory schools, but at times of war, of course, they had to revert back to their original métier. These two schools shared instructors and often celebrated important religious holidays together, and these photographs here are probably the happiest, most joyous photographs among the Hamidian, somber Hamidian photograph albums that we often look into for late 19th century visual culture. Perfect. Their best graduates were recruited as instructors not only for the institutions in the capital, but as teachers in the military schools of important provincial towns. We have a good record of art teachers being sent to Aleppo, Damascus, Thessaloniki, Manastir, which is now in Macedonia, and Anatolian towns such as Edirne, Erzurum, and Diyarbakir. The pedagogic tenets of the schools were extended then to the empire's borders. Also of note, with regards to such outreach, is that Hoca Ali Riza engraved and circulated booklets in the military middle schools across the empire that offered step-by-step tutorials in pattern making, sketching, and perspectival drawing, and these are a few pages from those books. The 4 to 7 year training that these individuals underwent endowed them with an artistic versatility that the Art Academy in its earliest instance was not able to offer. These military artists were multimedia artists who were instructed to observe and capture their physical environments using the various representational techniques in which they were trained. But of course, if you had to assess them solely as painters, they would be confined by genre into being landscapists. Mehmet Esad's biographies highlight the multidimensional artistic expertise of these individuals. And Abdullah Zuhdi, for instance, was a calligrapher and lithographer who not only wrote the inscriptional bands of the Prophet's mosque in Medina, which measured up to 2 kilometers, but also engraved the plates for Egypt's banknotes in 1860. Ahmet Emin, the tallest gentleman in the expedition photographs, was an accomplished engraver, bookbinder, portraitist, and photographer who was the unofficial leader of the 1886 expedition. And these individuals are a few, or 2, out of hundreds among Mehmet Esad's records. Scholars who seek an emulatory model where the Ottomans implemented all artistic institutions on the French inevitably overlook these individuals who fall through the cracks of mundane institutional histories and bureaucratic archives. And possibly paintings like these, copied directly from photographs, do not immediately incite formal engagement. I would argue that these photographic copies were not indication, as some scholars have suggested, of a lack of perspectival or plein air training, but rather only a sample of the Sultan's request to possess multiple representational versions of the commissioned task, a multimedia portfolio. Now, I would like to turn, lastly, to a familiar art historical figure interpreting the work of a relatively unfamiliar one. In the late 1970s, we find John Berger in Istanbul encountering Şeker Ahmet Pasha's sizable, undated painting, The Woodcutter in the Forest. Berger correctly identifies Şeker Ahmet's nod to the painterly tradition of the Barbizon school. After all, the Ottoman artist had a brief stint in Jérôme's Paris atelier and spent time in museums studying the works of Courbet. But then he returned to the military academy as a student. But Berger is mystified by the lack of perspective in the painting, that the beech tree on the far right both approaches and withdraws while the woodcutter and his mule are farthest when they should have been placed closest, Berger says, is an academic mistake. Another is the flatness of the brushwood, creating spatial ambiguity. Berger assumes that this juxtaposition of inconsistent perspective and foregrounded flatness as a practice that Ahmet carried over from his familiarity with Turkish pictorial tradition, that of book illumination, and interprets it as a factual challenge that the artist faced when trying to transform his representational manner. To this extent, Berger stumbles into an Orientalist stereotype. But what is salvaged from Berger's record of his encounter with the landscape is his reading of it as a painting which offers an immersive walkthrough. To Berger, Ahmet relayed the experience of the woodcutter walking through the forest rather than following Courbet, who would have rendered the forest as a scene observed from a distance. And I quote, Şeker Ahmet faced the forest as a thing taking place in itself, as a presence that was so pressing that he could not, as he had learned to do in Paris, maintain his distance from it. In telling the story of the woodcutter, Şeker Ahmet found himself facing the forest like the woodcutter. One has to imagine Ahmet as a student in the military academy, placed within a group and tasked with drawing up a topographical map of an imperial territory. Walking, measuring, and recording distances traversed, and altitudes spanned, all the while identifying the landscapes, textures, and vegetation. The group would have likely taken photographs, accompanied by field notes and pencil sketches. Ahmet's immersive depiction of the forest is a reflection of his training in the military academy, where a real sight had to be performed in multiple representational modes. A rare journal review of the 1849 exhibition promoting the work of the students of the military academy is illuminating in this respect, stating that the art of drawing, dessin, was only taught to aid in mastering volumes and topographic line work. The same review, mind you, commends a Turkish calligraphic sample done by hand for its lithographic precision. Peter Sheldall's recent review in The New Yorker of Thomas Cole's mid-century Catskill Creek scene says an uncanny affinity to the way Berger read Ahmet's work. Sheldall finds that though variable, labored, and containing persistent gawkiness, Cole's landscapes, like Ahmet via Berger, are sincere in their reconciliation with nature, which in turn is consuming and timeless. Cole, too, had arrived at academic painting later in his life. In his early years in the US as an English immigrant, he was an engraver who studied painting only when opportunities presented themselves. He would have to retrain his hand and eye to become a painter, one technique absorbed by another. It's this expected technical shift, the versatility of looking and rendering in various modes, and sometimes ways where multiple techniques are made to work in tandem, that I find intriguing in the Ottoman artists trained in these military schools prior to the Sanayi Nefise. Fortunately, we have now moved past the assumption that prior to Western artistic parameters, the Ottoman visual domain was monopolized by the arts of the book, a practice that in itself was similarly never timeless. More fruitful inquiries can be made in examining the ways in which 19th century Ottoman artists who worked across media articulated their representational choices. To begin to contemplate what these crossovers might yield, I leave you with another Sheker Ahmet landscape, which is inhabited by a military battalion in formation, and the first locally made topographic map of Istanbul that bears the same artist's imprimatur. Painting undertaken as topography, a surveying gaze performing an all too rigorous painter's perspective, and an overall attempt at conveying an immersive experience of a landscape. Thank you.